The stagecoach had been shaking for 6 days, and Verity Ashford had stopped counting the bruises on her ribs somewhere around the Wyoming border. She sat alone on the cracked leather bench, her only company, a worn leather valise pressed against her hip like a child clinging to its mother. Inside that valise lay everything she owned in this world. 2 dresses both mended more times than she could remember. A Bible with her mother's name inscribed on the first page in fading ink. A letter from a man she had never met, 3 lines long, promising nothing except a place to stand. And $40 that had carried her from the gray streets of Philadelphia to the edge of the known world. Outside the coach window, Montana territory unfolded like a Bible verse about creation. Mountains rose in every direction, their peaks already wearing white crowns of early snow. Pine forests, thick as velvet, covered the slopes, broken only by granite ridges that jutted upward like the spines of sleeping giants. The sky was so wide and so blue that Verity felt a kind of vertigo just looking at it, as though she might fall upward into all that emptiness and never stop. She closed her eyes and let the rocking of the coach carry her backward. Back to Philadelphia, back to the room she had shared with the mice in Aunt Martha's attic. Back to 4 years of scrubbing floors and washing linens and cooking meals she was not invited to eat. Aunt Martha had taken her in after the yellow fever, claimed both parents in the same terrible week, and Verity had been grateful. Grateful the way a dog is grateful for a chain that keeps it from starving, even as the chain cuts into its neck. When Aunt Martha died, her son Theodore had wasted no time. He appeared at the attic door at 2 in the morning, breath sour with whiskey, and pointed toward the street. "You think my mother kept you out of charity," he had said. "She kept you because you were cheap labor, a servant who didn't need paying. Now she's dead and I don't need a servant." Verity had stood on the sidewalk in the rain valise in hand and made herself a promise. She would never cry in front of someone who did not love her. Tears were currency, and she would not spend them on people who had no intention of paying her back. She walked 3 blocks to St. Patrick's Church. Father O'Brien, the only soul in Philadelphia who still remembered her face, opened the door without asking questions. She slept on a church pew for 3 nights. During the day, she helped cook in the charity kitchen, feeding people whose luck had run out even faster than hers. At night, she read newspapers by candlelight, searching for any crack in the wall of her circumstances. The advertisement was small, buried on the last page of the Philadelphia Inquirer, wedged between notices for horses and piano lessons. 3 lines of plain type that would change the entire course of her life. Respectable rancher of good standing seeks God-fearing, industrious wife for companionship and partnership on established Montana ranch. Safe passage provided. Serious inquiries. Right to E. Bridger, care of Copper Creek Post Office, Montana Territory. Verity read it 10 times. Each time the words "safe passage" glowed a little brighter, like a lighthouse beam cutting through fog. She wrote her reply that same night on paper borrowed from Father O'Brien in the finest handwriting Aunt Martha had beaten into her. She wrote the truth: orphaned, poor, no family, no assets, no prospects. But she also wrote what she could offer: 10 dishes she cooked well, the types of stitching she knew, and a passage from Proverbs that had always felt like it was written about the woman she wanted to become. She did not pretend romance. She did not promise love. She wrote simply, "I am not looking for love, Mr. Bridger. I am looking for purpose. If you need a woman who works hard and asks for little, I am that woman." 6 weeks later, the reply arrived. Short, polite, accompanied by $40 in crisp bills, more money than Verity had ever held at once. "Miss Ashford, your letter shows character. Passage enclosed. Arrive Copper Creek by October's end." Father O'Brien walked her to the train station. He pressed a small wooden cross into her palm. "Are you sure about this? Verity? Montana is wild." "I've survived Philadelphia, Father. Montana can't be worse." The old priest smiled sadly. "Pray, child, and if the man turns out to be a scoundrel, pray harder, then run." She boarded the train without looking back. Philadelphia disappeared behind her in a smear of gray smoke, and Verity thought, whatever waits in Montana, I will meet it standing. Now, 6 days later, The stagecoach lurched over the final mountain pass, and the valley of Copper Creek opened before her like a secret whispered by the earth itself. A small town clung to the banks of a silver creek, wooden buildings lined up along a single dirt road, smoke rising from chimneys into the cold October sky. Beyond the town, the mountains rose like cathedral walls, their slopes dark with timber, their peaks bright with snow. Verity pressed her forehead against the cold glass and whispered to herself, "This is home now, whatever home means." The stagecoach groaned to a stop in front of a weathered building with a crooked sign that read, "Stage Stop in Post Office." Verity gathered her valise, smoothed her wrinkled navy dress as best she could, and stepped down onto Montana soil for the first time. Her legs trembled from 6 days of sitting. Her shoulders ached. Her stomach was empty. The mountain wind cut through her thin wool cloak like it was made of paper. She looked around for the man who was supposed to meet her. One man, that was what she expected. One rancher, one face, one beginning. She saw three. Three men stood beside the hitching rail, and the sight of them stopped her breath in her chest. They were tall, all of them, unnaturally, almost impossibly tall, like three oak trees grown from the same root, broad across the shoulders, built as though God had designed them for the specific purpose of moving mountains with their bare hands. The one in the middle stepped forward first. He was the tallest of the three and the oldest. His wide-brimmed brown hat sat low on his forehead, casting shadow across a face that was handsome in the way granite cliffs are handsome hard-weathered, carved by forces that did not care about softness. His eyes were the color of amber, held up to firelight, sharp and assessing, and they locked onto Verity with the focused intensity of a man who was used to measuring things. Land, cattle, threats, and now apparently women who arrived on stagecoaches with nothing but a valise and a prayer. "Mrs. Ashford." His voice was deep, rough, like gravel, smoothed by a river that had long since dried up. "Miss," Verity corrected. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "Miss Ashford." "Verity." A beat of silence. The man nodded. "Cordell Bridger." He did not offer his hand. "These are my brothers, Thatcher." The second man was slightly shorter but no less powerfully built. His hair was dark blonde, tousled by the wind, and his eyes were the warm color of good whiskey. Where Cordell's face was all angles and stone, Thatcher's held a gentleness that softened his jaw and warmed his gaze. He touched the brim of his hat and nodded. "Ma'am." "And Nolan." The third was the youngest, and Verity knew it instantly. Not because of his face, which was sharp and defiant, but because of the way he held himself. Like a challenge, like a dare. His auburn hair fell across his forehead in wild tangles. His amber eyes, so like Cordell's, burned with something hotter and more dangerous. He did not nod, did not touch his hat. He leaned against the hitching post with his arms folded across his chest and looked at Verity the way a man looks at a horse he has no intention of buying. "Brothers," Verity repeated, and she heard the tremor in her own voice. "The advertisement didn't mention brothers." "The advertisement said a lot of things." Nolan's voice was sharp enough to draw blood. Cordell turned and looked at his youngest brother with an expression that could have split wood. Nolan fell silent. Thatcher stepped forward and gently took the valise from Verity's hand. "You've had a long journey, Miss Ashford. Let's get you out of this cold. Questions can wait until you've eaten." Verity wanted to say that questions could not wait, that she had spent 6 days on a rattling stagecoach to meet one man, not three, that she did not know which of these towering strangers was meant to be her husband or whether any of them truly wanted a wife at all. But her feet were numb, her stomach was empty, and the mountain wind was slicing through her dress like a knife through silk. So she followed them. They rode up the mountain for over an hour. Verity sat behind Thatcher on his horse because she did not know how to ride. Cordell had offered first, but Nolan muttered something under his breath, and Cordell's jaw tightened before he nodded toward Thatcher instead. Thatcher held the reins with steady hands and kept a respectful distance behind him, close enough that she would not fall, but far enough that propriety was preserved. When the horse crossed a shallow creek, he said quietly, "Hold tight here, Miss Ashford. Water's cold if you fall." Verdi used the ride to study them. All three brothers shared the same impossible height, the same broad shoulders, the same ease on horseback that spoke of men who had been born in the saddle. But beyond those surfaces, they were different in every way that mattered. Cordell rode at the front, back straight as an arrow, never once looking behind him. He was granite, silent, immovable. Thatcher was a stream gentle but certain, following his own course with quiet persistence. And Nolan was fire restless and unpredictable, spurring his horse to gallop ahead and then circling back as though the pace of ordinary life was too slow for his blood. The ranch appeared without warning, revealing itself around the last turn in the trail like a secret the mountain had been keeping. Verity's breath caught. It was not the small cabin she had imagined. This was a real homestead, a two-story house built from pine logs, wide and solid, with a covered porch wrapping around three sides. A large barn painted dark red, a storehouse, cattle pens stretching toward the base of the mountains where a herd of Hereford cows moved slowly through the golden grass. Smoke curled from the chimney, warm and amber, against a sky that was deepening to purple. "This is your ranch?" Verity asked, and she could hear the disbelief in her own voice. Cordell stopped his horse and looked back at her for the first time since they had left town. "Our father built it. We kept it." 4 words. But behind them, Verity heard an entire history. Pride, burden, sacrifice. She looked at the house again, and this time she noticed what was missing. The porch steps were worn thin. The window curtains had faded to gray. One of the side doors hung crooked on its hinges. The house was clean, but empty of warmth. No flowers, no lace curtains, no smell of baking bread. This was a house of men, a house that had lost its soul. When they stopped before the porch, Verity looked up at the second-floor windows. A small face appeared behind the glass. A girl. Dark hair, large, solemn eyes. The child vanished the instant Verity's gaze met hers, disappearing from the window like a ghost retreating into a wall. "That's Willa," Thatcher said softly. "Cordell's daughter. She's shy with new people." "She doesn't want you here." Nolan spoke flatly, stepping past Verity without looking at her. "Neither do I." "Nolan?" Cordell's voice cracked like a whip. Silence. Nolan walked inside and slammed the door behind him. Thatcher sighed. "Forgive my brother, Miss Ashford. He doesn't mean to be cruel." "It's fine." Verity surprised herself with the steadiness in her own voice. "I'd rather know where I stand than guess." Cordell looked at her then, really looked for the first time, not assessing or measuring, but seeing. Something shifted in his amber eyes, small as a hairline crack in ice. "Come inside, Miss Ashford. We have things to discuss." Inside, the house was larger and emptier than Verity had expected. The main room stretched wide and long, anchored by a stone fireplace, tall enough for a man to stand in its mantel bare, except for a single tin photograph in a tarnished frame. Verity caught a glimpse of the image as she passed. A woman, young, dark-haired, smiling in a way that suggested she had been laughing just before the photograph was taken. Linnea, the dead wife, the ghost whose absence filled every room the way silence fills a church after the last hymn has ended. Leather chairs flanked the fireplace. A gun rack hung on the wall holding 3 rifles and a shotgun, all cleaned in oil with military precision. A bearskin rug lay before the hearth, worn thin from years of heavy boots. The walls were bare pine, no paintings, no decorations, nothing that suggested anyone in this house cared about beauty or comfort. Only function, only survival. The kitchen sat at the back. It was wide and well-equipped with a cast-iron stove large enough to cook for a regiment, a heavy wooden table built to seat 6, and shelves lined with tins and jars arranged with the same grim efficiency as the gun rack. Everything was clean but joyless. No flowers on the table, no curtains at the window, no herbs drying from the rafters, no smell of anything baking or sweet or alive. This was a house where people survived. It had forgotten how to be a home where people lived. Dutch Harlan, the foreman, waited in the kitchen. He was a small man compared to the brothers, but built like an anvil with sun-darkened skin, creased deep as old leather, and eyes as blue and bright as a summer sky. He looked at Verity, nodded slowly, and offered the first genuine smile she had received since arriving in Montana. Miss Ashford, welcome. Supper's on the stove. Ain't fancy, but it's hot. They sat at the kitchen table, and Cordell gave her the truth she had asked for. He spoke carefully, choosing each word the way a man crosses a frozen river, testing each step before committing his weight. The advertisement had been Dutch's idea. Cordell had agreed because his daughter needed stability, a woman's presence. But Dutch had written the actual letter without Cordell's full review. What Cordell means, Dutch said, clearing his throat with obvious discomfort, is that I may have simplified things a mite, made it sound like there was just one fella here. There isn't, Verity said. There are three. Heavy silence. The fire crackled. Nolan snorted from his corner by the wall. Cordell stood. His chair scraped against the wooden floor. He turned to Verity, and in the firelight, she saw his face clearly for the first time. Younger than she had guessed, but wearier than his years, as though sorrow had added a decade to his eyes. Miss Ashford, I brought you here because my daughter needs a mother. I will not pretend to offer love. I don't know if I have that left, but I can offer you a home, safety, respect, and in time maybe something more, if you'll have me. Verity looked at him, then at Thatcher, who watched her with quiet hope like a man who had found a book he wanted to read but was afraid to open. Then at Nolan, who stared into the fire with his jaw clenched shut, refusing to look at any of them. I came 6 days on a stagecoach, Verity said slowly. I have nowhere to go back to. I have nothing. No family, no money, no prospects. She paused. But I didn't come here to be pitied, and I didn't come here to be a servant dressed as a wife. She proposed her terms. 1 month. She would work. She would earn her keep. At the end of 30 days, if it did not feel right for either of them or for Willa, she would leave. No hard feelings, no debt, and she would sleep in her own room with a lock on the door. The words came out steady, measured, as though she were negotiating a business contract rather than the rest of her life. But inside, Verity's heart was hammering so hard she was certain every man in the room could hear it. She was bluffing. She had nowhere else to go if this failed. No second plan, no fallback. If Cordell Bridger said no, she would be standing on that stagecoach platform again alone, with nothing but a valise and a prayer, and the knowledge that the world had no place for a woman who refused to be owned. Cordell studied her for a long moment. His amber eyes moved across her face the way a man reads a contract, looking for the clause that would betray him. But whatever he was searching for, he did not find it, because Verity Ashford was not hiding anything. She had laid every card on the table face up and dared him to do the same. Then he nodded. You'll have Linnea's room. It has a lock. Something flickered across his face when he said the name. Pain quick as a knife drawn and sheathed. Linnea, his dead wife, the woman whose absence had turned this house into a shell. Verity stood and extended her hand. Cordell looked at it, a small hand roughened by work, steady as bedrock. He took it. His palm was enormous, calloused, warm. The handshake lasted 2 seconds, but Verity felt it in her spine. Thatcher will show you upstairs, Cordell said. Then he turned and walked out the back door into the cold evening, and Verity understood that she had just shaken hands with a man who was terrified of her. That first night, Verity could not sleep. She lay in Linnea's old sewing room, a small space made warm by a patchwork quilt, in the faint ghost of dried lavender, listening to the house breathe. The wind howled outside. Somewhere below, heavy footsteps paced back and forth. Cordell, unable to sleep, either walking the downstairs rooms like a sentry guarding a fortress against enemies he could not name. Around midnight, Verity heard the sound that changed everything. Crying, soft muffled, coming through the wall from the room beside hers. Willa. Verity lay still, fighting herself. This was not her child. This was not her home. She had no right to cross that threshold. But the crying continued, not the wailing of a child who expected comfort, but the quiet practiced sobbing of a little girl who had learned to cry without hope that anyone would come. Verity knew that sound. She had made it herself in Aunt Martha's attic for 4 long years. She rose, crossed the dark hallway, knocked gently on Willa's door. The crying stopped. Silence, not the silence of sleep, but the silence of a child holding her breath. "Willa," Verity whispered, "it's Miss Ashford. I heard you. Are you all right?" No answer. "I won't come in if you don't want me to, but I'm right next door. If you need anything, even if it's just someone to sit with." Long silence. Then very small, through the crack beneath the door, Mama used to sing. Verity's heart tightened until she could barely breathe. What did she sing? Amazing Grace. But only the first verse. She said the rest was too sad. Verity closed her eyes. She remembered her own mother singing that hymn in a kitchen in Philadelphia that smelled of bread and lavender before the fever, before everything was taken. Verity had not sung in years. Not since the funeral. Not since the attic. Her voice might have rusted shut from disuse and grief. But she thought of the child behind the door, a child who had lost her mother the way Verity had lost hers, and she understood that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is not fight wolves or cross mountains. Sometimes it is simply to open their mouth and sing when every instinct says to stay silent. She sang, quietly trembling, her voice cracked and imperfect, carried through the closed door like light slipping through a keyhole. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Only the first verse, just as Linnea had done. Then silence. On the other side of the door, the crying had stopped. Verity slid down the wall and sat on the floor, arms wrapped around her knees, listening to Willa's breathing slow and deepen into sleep. She did not know that at the end of the hallway in the darkness, Cordell Bridger stood with his back against the wall, and his eyes closed and his fists clenched, so tight his knuckles had gone white. She did not know that for the first time in 2 years, the man made of granite was crying without sound. Dawn came gray and bitter. Verity rose before the sun, driven by a habit batten into her during 4 years of servitude. She went downstairs to the kitchen where Dutch had already started the coffee. He looked surprised to see her, and, "You're up early." "I'm up always." Verity surveyed the kitchen with the trained eye of a woman who had spent years making something from nothing. The pantry was disorganized but well-stocked. Dried venison, potatoes, eggs, butter, flour, sugar, yeast. Everything a good cook needed, and no one in this house who knew how to use it properly. She lifted the lid on the pot of soup sitting on the stove. Brown water with a few dissolving potato chunks. No seasoning, no soul. "Who does the cooking?" Verity asked. Dutch winced. "I do, and before you say anything, I know. When was the last time anyone made bread in this house?" "Linnea, 2 years ago." Verity rolled up her sleeves. "Show me where the flour is." 2 hours later, when the three Bridger brothers walked into the kitchen, the smell hit them before anything else. Fresh bread, golden biscuits cooling on the table, scrambled eggs with herbs that Verity had found growing wild behind the house, bacon fried crisp, coffee hot and strong, and a jar of preserved jam that she had discovered in the back of a forgotten shelf, still good sweet and dark as garnet. Cordell stopped in the kitchen doorway. He stared at the table. Then he stared at Verity, who stood beside the stove in a borrowed apron, her cheeks flushed from the heat, wisps of honey blonde hair escaping from her bun. For the first time since Linnea had died, the house smelled like home. "You didn't have to do this," he said. His voice was rougher than usual. "I told you I'd earned my keep." Verity set another plate of biscuits on the table. "Sit down, Mr. Bridger. Your food's getting cold." Thatcher sat down, first eyes bright. "Miss Verity, I haven't smelled bread like this since—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "In a long time." Nolan sat without speaking, but he ate. He ate 2 biscuits, then 3, then reached for the butter, and when Verity set a third plate on the table, he looked up, just for a second, and nodded. He did not say thank you, but he nodded, and Verity understood that for Nolan Bridger a nod was more than most people ever received. Willa appeared at the foot of the stairs, clutching a cloth doll with button eyes and tangled yarn hair. She stood there small and watchful, studying Verity the way a fawn studies a clearing before stepping into the open. Verity knelt until she was eye level with the child. "Good morning, Willa. Do you like biscuits? With jam?" Willa looked at her father. Cordell gave a small nod. The girl climbed into her chair and chose a seat beside Verity instead of beside her father. A small choice, but every person in that kitchen felt its weight. Cordell watched his daughter sit beside a stranger eating biscuits, with both hands jam smeared at the corner of her mouth, and something moved across his face that was not quite a smile but lived in the same neighborhood. Over the next 3 days, Verity found her rhythm in the Bridger house. She rose before dawn, cooked, cleaned, washed clothes, mended torn shirts, and patched worn trousers with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She worked the way she always had, steadily and without complaint, because work was the only language she had ever been fluent in. She watched the brothers and learned their patterns. Cordell left before sunrise and returned after dark, eating quickly, checking on Willa, then sitting before the fire with the ranch ledgers until his eyes could no longer focus. He did not make small talk. He did not tell jokes. When Verity asked him a question, he answered exactly, wasting not a single word, then returned to his work. But each morning he left a bucket of warm water outside her bedroom door. Never mentioned it, never waited for thanks. Verity understood this was Cordell's language of care. Action without words. He could not say what he felt, but he could carry water up a flight of stairs in the dark, so that a woman he barely knew could wash her face in warmth instead of cold. One afternoon, while the brothers were out with the cattle, Dutch sat at the kitchen table mending a bridle strap while Verity kneaded bread dough. They worked in comfortable silence, the kind that forms between people who have accepted each other's presence without needing to fill every moment with noise. "You're wondering about their father," Dutch said suddenly. Verity looked up. "Everyone mentions Linnea, nobody mentions him." Dutch's knife paused. His blue eyes held something old and heavy. "Amos Bridger was the strongest man I ever knew. Built this ranch from nothing. Came up from Colorado with 20 head of cattle and a temper hot enough to smelt iron." He was quiet for a moment. "But strength isn't always goodness, and power doesn't always know when to stop." He said nothing more, and Verity did not push. But she filed the words away like a letter she would read again later when their meaning became clear. Thatcher divided his time between ranch work and paperwork, managing the books and writing correspondence with suppliers. In the evenings, he read beside the fire. Shakespeare, Dickens. He was the one who talked to Verity most, asking about Philadelphia, about books about her life before Montana. He spoke easily, naturally, as though she had always been there. It was comfortable and unsettling at once, because each time Thatcher laughed, Verity felt warmth bloom in her chest that she did not fully understand. Nolan avoided her. He ate fast, left early, returned late often, smelling of whiskey from whatever saloon he had found in town. But Verity noticed something. On the second morning, she found a skinned rabbit on the porch step. No one claimed it, but Verity saw Nolan's boot prints in the snow, leading from the barn to the porch and back again. She cooked the rabbit into stew for supper. When Nolan ate, she said casually, "Good rabbit. Whoever caught it knows what they're doing." Nolan did not look up, but his ears turned red. Willa remained the most complex puzzle. During the day, the child watched Verity from a distance, appearing behind curtains, around doorways, under tables. She did not speak after that first night, but she did not leave either. She waited the way a deer waits at the edge of a stream, testing the air for danger before bending to drink. On the third day, Willa appeared on the porch where Verity sat mending a dress. She stood 3 steps away, clutching her cloth doll. "Her name's Rosie," Willa said, not looking at Verity. "Mama made her." Verity looked at the doll. White cotton fabric, yellowed with age, eyes embroidered in blue thread hair, made from brown yarn that had become tangled and matted. One of the doll's arms had come loose at the seam, stuffing poking through like a wound. "Rosie's arm is hurt," Verity said gently. Willa hugged the doll tighter. "Papa can't sew. Uncle Thatcher tried, but it looked wrong." She looked up, and her eyes dark and solemn as pools of still water held both hope and fear in equal measure. Can you fix her without changing her? She has to stay the same, because Mama made her. Verity understood immediately. This was not a request for mending. This was a test, perhaps the most important test of her life. I promise, Verity said, keeping her voice steady as stone. I won't change Rosie. I'll just help her heal. Willa placed the doll in Verity's hands with the solemnity of a priest handling a relic. Then she sat down beside Verity and watched every stitch silent, her eyes growing brighter as the doll's arm was made whole again, with stitches so small and precise that they matched the original perfectly. When Verity finished, Willa picked up the doll, examined it carefully, then looked at Verity. You sew like Mama. 3 words. They struck Verity harder than anything Nolan had ever said. On the 5th night, everything changed. The wind shifted. It swung around from the north, carrying the deep cold of early winter and on its back, the kind of cold that does not merely chill the skin, but reaches into the chest and squeezes. Dutch stepped outside, tasted the air, studied the clouds piling against the mountains like gray battalions preparing for war, and came back inside with a face that told Verity everything she needed to know before he spoke. Storm coming, big one, maybe 3 days. The brothers spent the entire day preparing. Cordell and Nolan drove cattle into the lower pastures closest to the barn. Thatcher reinforced fencing that the wind might tear loose. They moved with the urgent efficiency of men who had survived Montana winters before and carried the memory of those survivals in their bones. Verity cooked extra soup, salted meat, checked the wood supply, sealed drafts around windows with rags, and readied the house for a siege the way a captain readies a ship for a hurricane. Willa helped her. The child stayed close now, no longer watching from doorways but standing beside Verity, small hands busy with tasks she invented for herself, folding cloth, stacking tins, asking an endless stream of quiet questions. What's that spice called? Why do you fold the dough 3 times instead of 2? Did your mama teach you to cook? Each question was a small door that Willa opened one at a time, letting Verity a little further inside. Night fell. The storm had not yet arrived, but the wind was screaming through the pines like something alive and angry. The 3 brothers were out at the barn for a final check on the horses. Verity and Willa were alone in the house. Dutch was in the storehouse inventorying supplies. I forgot Rosie, Willa said suddenly. Where? The barn, the hay room. I was playing there today. Verity looked through the window. Darkness thick and absolute filled with the howling wind. We'll get her tomorrow, sweetheart. No, Willa's voice cracked like a twig snapping. Mama made her. She can't be alone in the dark. She gets scared. Verity heard what the child was really saying. Not about the doll, about herself. Stay here, Verity said. Lock the door behind me. I'll be right back. She grabbed the lantern and stepped into the night. The wind nearly knocked her flat. She crossed the yard 50 yards to the barn, the lantern swinging wildly in her grip, throwing crazy shadows against the buildings. She found Rosie in the hayloft, tucked the doll inside her coat, and turned to leave. That was when she heard it. Not the wind, something beneath the wind, lower, closer, the sound that every living creature recognizes in the deepest part of its brain, the sound that turns blood to ice and locks muscles in place. Growling. Verity pressed herself against the barn door and peered through a gap in the planks. She saw them, 4, 5, 6 gray shapes moving through the darkness, their eyes catching the lantern light and throwing it back as orange embers. Wolves, driven down from the high country by the coming storm, drawn toward the ranch by the smell of livestock and warmth. She could not cross the yard, not with the pack between her and the house. But Willa was inside. Willa was safe. Then the front door opened. Miss Verity. Miss Verity, Willa's voice cut through the wind, high and thin and frightened. The child stood on the porch holding an oil lamp looking for Verity. She had not seen the wolves, but the wolves had seen her. 2 of them turned toward the house. Verity did not think. Thinking would have stopped her. She threw open the barn door and ran into the yard, placing herself directly between the wolves and the child. She screamed, not a scream of fear, but a scream of battle raw and primal, the scream of a woman who had already lost everything and therefore had nothing left to protect except this one small life. She hurled the lantern at the ground. Glass shattered. Oil, call it fire. A streak of flame bloomed across the frozen earth, bright and sudden as lightning. The wolves flinched. 1 second. Two. Verity lunged for Willa, swept the child into her arms, stumbled backward through the front door, and kicked it shut behind her. In the same breath, rifle shots split the night. The three Bridger brothers came running from behind the storehouse, guns blazing, and the wolves scattered into the darkness like smoke torn apart by wind. The door crashed open. Cordell burst in eyes wild, rifle in his fist, searching for his daughter with the desperate focus of a man whose entire world had narrowed to a single point. He found her, safe, wrapped in Verity's arms, crying but whole. Cordell dropped to his knees and gathered them both in his arms. Both of them, Verity and Willa together, and Verity felt the full strength of this man, all that granite and iron shaking against her like a tree in a hurricane. "She's safe," Verity whispered. "She's safe." Cordell pulled back and looked at Verity. In his amber eyes, she watched every wall he had built over 2 years of solitary grief collapse in a single instant, not crumbling slowly, falling all at once like a dam giving way. "Thank you." 2 words, but he spoke them like a man speaking a prayer. Thatcher came in next, face white as ash. "Are you all right, Verity? You're bleeding." Verity looked down. Her hands were cut. Shards from the shattered lantern had sliced her palms when she threw it. Blood ran between her fingers. She had not felt a thing. Nolan entered last. He leaned against the door frame, breathing hard, rifle still in his hand. He looked at Verity, small, bleeding, clutching a child who did not belong to her. And on his face, for the first time since she arrived, there was no contempt, no mockery, no anger, only astonishment. "You ran at wolves," Nolan said. His voice was flat, but his eyes told a different story. "Unarmed, for a child that isn't yours." Verity looked at him. "She is mine. She called for me." Absolute silence. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind screamed, and inside the Bridger house, everything shifted on its axis permanently and without possibility of return. Nolan nodded, slowly, deeply. Then he turned and walked outside without another word. But Verity knew what had just happened. She had passed Nolan's test, not with words, with blood. Thatcher cleaned Verity's hands in the kitchen, picking glass from her palms with a pair of tweezers while she sat at the table and tried not to wince. His fingers were surprisingly gentle for their size, moving with the careful precision of a man accustomed to handling fragile things. Books, perhaps, or the feelings he kept so carefully hidden behind his easy smile. "You could have been killed," Thatcher said quietly, not looking up from his work. She was on the porch, alone. "I know." He wrapped her hands in clean linen strips, tying them carefully. His fingers lingered on her wrist for just a moment, his thumb resting against the pulse point where her heart was still hammering. Then he let go and stepped back. "I know why you did it. I'm just saying the world would be a darker place without you in it, Verity Ashford. And that's something worth remembering." He left the kitchen. Verity sat alone, holding her bandaged hands in front of her, and realized that her heart was beating fast for two different reasons. One was the wolves, the other she was not ready to name. That night, Willa slept in Verity's room, curled against her side, one hand clutching Rosie, her head resting on Verity's shoulder. Verity stayed awake through the long hours, listening to the storm that had finally arrived, holding a child who was not hers, but who had called her name in the dark. And downstairs, the three Bridger brothers sat around the dying fire without speaking, each of them knowing the same truth. Verity Ashford was no longer a guest. She was the woman who had shed blood for their family. And in the law of the mountains, blood creates a bond stronger than any contract signed by men. The storm lasted 3 days. 3 days sealed inside the house, cut off from the world's snow, piling against the windows until the glass disappeared behind walls of white. 3 days during which the five of them and Dutch lived in a space that shrank smaller with each passing hour, forcing proximity, forcing conversation, forcing the kind of intimacy that only isolation can create. Verity cooked. She told stories to Willa, inventing tales about a brave girl who lived on a mountain and made friends with eagles and bears. Willa named the girl, Mountain Verity, and demanded a new chapter every night. Verity mended torn clothes for all three brothers, her needle moving through fabric with the steady rhythm of a heartbeat. She patched Cordell's work shirts. She reinforced the elbows of Thatcher's reading jacket. She sewed a button back onto Nolan's coat, and when she left it folded on his chair, he picked it up, examined her stitching, and nodded once without comment. For Nolan, that nod was practically a standing ovation. Slowly, carefully, stitch by stitch, Verity was putting the broken house back together. On the third night, as the storm finally began to exhaust itself, Verity opened the drawer of the writing desk in Linnea's room looking for sewing thread. She found something else. A bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon, written in a woman's handwriting, elegant, but shaking as though the hand that held the pen had been trembling with emotion. The name on the first envelope, written in ink that had turned brown with age, stopped Verity's breath. Celia, Celia Bridger, the mother of the three brothers, the woman who had walked away from her children 20 years ago and never come back. Verity held the letter in her trembling hands. She knew she should not read them. These were not her letters. These were not her secrets. This was someone else's pain, someone else's truth, locked away in a drawer for reasons she could not begin to understand. But the first line of the topmost letter was visible through the fold, and the words burned themselves into Verity's eyes before she could look away. My dearest boys, if you are reading this, then I have failed to come back, and I need you to know the truth about why I left. Verity stood in the small room, storm light flickering through the frosted window, the bundle of letters heavy in her hands, and felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Somewhere in these pages lay a secret that had shaped three men, broken a family, and haunted this house like a ghost that refused to rest. She set the letters down, closed the drawer, pressed her palms flat against the wood, and breathed until her heart stopped hammering. Not tonight. Tonight she would sleep and hold the child and listen to the last whispers of the storm. But tomorrow or the day after, that Verity Ashford would open those letters. And when she did, nothing in the Bridger house would ever be the same again. The storm broke on a Tuesday morning. Verity woke to silence so complete it felt like a sound of its own, the absence of 3 days of screaming wind, replaced by a stillness that pressed against the windows like cotton. She rose, pulled the curtain aside, and saw a world remade in white. Snow covered everything. The barn, the fences, the cattle pens, the mountains themselves had all disappeared beneath a blanket of white so bright it hurt to look at under the hard winter sun. The ranch sat in the center of it like a ship frozen in an Arctic sea, isolated, unreachable, the only proof that human beings existed at all. The three Bridger brothers went to work, immediately moving with the grim efficiency of men who understood that in Montana, a storm was not the danger. The aftermath was the danger. Cordell and Nolan rode out to check fences and find cattle that had scattered during the blizzard. Thatcher climbed onto the barn roof to repair a section of shingles that the wind had torn loose. Dutch shoveled paths between the buildings, his short, powerful body driving the spade into drifts taller than himself. Verity tucked Celia's letters deep into the bottom of her valise and locked it shut. She had not read beyond that first terrible line, and the words sat in her mind like a splinter beneath the skin, too deep to reach, too sharp to ignore. But she could not read them yet. She had only just begun to build trust with his family. Opening someone else's secrets without permission would shatter everything she had earned with biscuits and stitching and blood. Instead, she focused on what she could do. She kept the house warm. She kept the kitchen alive. She kept Willa safe. And slowly, carefully, like spring melting snow from the inside out, the Bridger house began to change. Willa bloomed first. The shy child who had watched Verity through doorways and around curtains now followed her everywhere, a small shadow with a cloth doll in one hand and an endless supply of questions in the other. She stood on a stool beside Verity in the kitchen, learning to knead dough with small, determined fists. She carried laundry baskets to the porch, struggling under the weight but refusing help. She sat beside Verity in the evenings, watching her sew, and asked questions that revealed a mind far sharper than her 7 years. What's that spice called? Why does bread need to rise twice? If I learn to sew, can I make a sister for Rosie? Verity began teaching Willa to read using the Bible because it was the only book she knew by heart. They sat together at the kitchen table after breakfast, Willa's small finger tracing beneath each word while Verity sounded it out. Willa learned fast, her dark eyes lighting up each time a cluster of letters transformed into meaning. The morning she sounded out her first complete word, she shouted it so loud that Dutch dropped his coffee cup in the next room. G-O-D, God, it says God. Willa threw her arms around Verity's neck, and Verity had to turn her face toward the window so the child would not see her tears. Every evening, Verity told Willa a story before bed, not fairy tales. Verity did not know many of those. Instead, she invented stories about a brave girl who lived alone on a mountain, who made friends with eagles and bears, who built her house from stones and sang lullabies to the wolves until they lay down and slept. Willa named the girl Mountain Verity and demanded a new chapter every night. One evening in the second week, Willa lay in her bed with the covers pulled to her chin and her eyes heavy with approaching sleep. Miss Verity, when Mountain Verity finds her family, will she stay? Verity was quiet for a long moment. What do you think? I think she should stay. Willa yawned, her small mouth opening wide. Because the mountain needs her, even if she doesn't know it yet. Verity sat beside the bed until the child's breathing deepened into sleep, and she thought this is what it feels like to be needed, not used, not tolerated, needed. The difference was so vast it might as well have been the distance between Philadelphia and Montana. The brothers changed too, each in his own way. Cordell no longer avoided her. He was still a man of few words, but he began lingering at the breakfast table after eating, asking if Verity needed supplies, if the firewood was holding out, if Willa was sleeping through the night. When Verity cooked, he sometimes stood in the kitchen doorway, one hand braced against the frame, watching her work without speaking. His amber eyes had lost their sharpness, or perhaps not lost it, but softened it into something warmer, the way iron becomes steel when fire teaches it to bend. Once when Verity turned from the stove unexpectedly, she caught him looking at her with an expression she could not name. Pain and longing and fear all tangled together like roots beneath the same tree. He turned away before she could speak and walked outside without explanation. Nolan's changes were the most surprising. He still did not talk to Verity, but he stopped being cruel. The muttered insults disappeared. The contemptuous silences were replaced by a different kind of silence, one that felt more like shyness than hostility, and gifts began to appear. A bundle of wild sage and mountain thyme left on the porch step, a branch of winter cedar placed in a jar on the kitchen windowsill, a small piece of wood no larger than Verity's palm, carved into the shape of a deer left on the counter where she would find it in the morning. Nolan never claimed credit. Verity never offered thanks directly, understanding instinctively that acknowledging the gifts would embarrass him into stopping. Instead, she cooked the dishes he liked best, thick stew with extra potatoes, and when he finished eating, she simply nodded. Nolan nodded back. It was their language spoken entirely without words. On the third week, the snow had melted enough for travel, and Thatcher offered to take Verity into Copper Creek. She needed fabric for new clothes for Willa, who was growing out of everything she owned. Cordell agreed reluctantly, and Verity sensed that he would have preferred to keep her on the mountain where gossip could not reach her. Copper Creek was exactly the kind of small western town Verity had read about in newspapers but never imagined seeing. A single dirt road lined with wooden buildings on both sides, a general store, a post office, a saloon with swinging doors, a white clapboard church, and the most imposing building of all, a brick bank that stood among the wooden structures like a rich man at a poor man's table. The whisper started before Verity even stepped through the door of the general store. Every person in Copper Creek had already heard the Bridger brothers had brought a mail-order bride up the mountain. The shopkeeper stared with undisguised curiosity. Two older women at the fabric counter leaned their heads together and whispered just loud enough to be heard. That's her, younger than I expected. Pretty little thing. Wonder how long before she runs like the last one. The last one didn't run. She died. Verity pretended she had not heard, but her spine straightened as though someone had poured cold water down her back. Thatcher noticed. He stepped closer, his voice low but firm. Ignore them, Verity. Small towns talk because they have nothing better to do. The bell above the store door chimed, and a woman walked in who made every other person in the room seem to fade slightly, like paintings left too long in sunlight. Lorelei Bancroft was tall, dark-haired with her glossy black tresses swept up in an elaborate arrangement that must have taken an hour to assemble. Her eyes were the pale blue of winter sky, beautiful and cold. Her skin was porcelain white, carefully protected from the Montana sun, and her navy silk dress was cut with a precision that spoke of tailors and money, and the kind of life that Verity had only ever glimpsed through the windows of houses she was not permitted to enter. Standing next to Lorelei, Verity felt her own mended cotton dress shrink around her like an apology. Lorelei's gaze swept over Verity from head to hem in a single practice motion, the way a horse trader appraises stock at auction, and then she smiled. It was the sweetest smile Verity had ever seen and the coldest. "So you're the Bridger bride, Lorelei Bancroft. Welcome to Copper Creek." Lorelei extended her hand. Verity took it. Lorelei's palm was soft, uncalloused, adorned with a diamond ring that caught the light and threw small rainbows across the counter. "Ashford, from back east, I hear. Philadelphia." "Yes. How adventurous of you." Lorelei's smile did not waver. 3 brothers all alone up that mountain. Must be quite the adjustment. Verity felt the needle hidden behind the silk. "They've been welcoming." "Oh, I'm sure. Linnea was a dear friend of mine, you know, before she passed. We were very close." Lorelei paused. "She used to tell me how the isolation up there made her feel like she was disappearing." "Linnea died of pneumonia," Verity said flatly. "Not loneliness." Something shifted behind Lorelei's eyes, quick as a snake drawing back before a strike. "Of course, just making conversation." On the ride home, Thatcher told Verity what she needed to know. Lorelei had married Edmund Bancroft, the town banker, 10 years ago. A marriage of convenience, not love. After Linnea died, Lorelei had begun visiting the Bridger Ranch with increasing frequency, bringing food gifts for Willem, words of comfort that were shaped like kindness but tasted like strategy. Everyone in Copper Creek understood what Lorelei wanted, not Cordell himself, but what Cordell represented: land, wealth, the largest ranch in the territory, power that a woman in the 1870s could only access through a man. "Cordell never gave her an inch," Thatcher said, "but she hasn't stopped trying. Your arrival changes things, for her." Verity understood. She had just become an opponent in a game whose rules she had not been taught. That same week, Verity discovered the second secret. She was cleaning Cordell's study, a task he had grudgingly permitted as long as she did not touch the papers on his desk. But the desk had a stuck drawer, and when Verity pulled hard enough to free it, a folded map slid out from beneath a stack of ranch documents. It was not an ordinary ranch map. It was a geological survey marked with technical notations and red pencil circles. One area on the northern slope of the mountain behind the ranch was labeled in careful block letters: "Verified Vein 3, assessing $200,000 plus." Verity stood very still, the map in her hands, her heart beating so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. $200,000. In an era when a working cowboy earned $30 a month, that was a king's fortune. The Bridger brothers were not simply ranchers. They were sitting on a gold mine, literally. She put the map back exactly where she had found it and did not speak of it to anyone. But the discovery rearranged everything in her mind. The whispers about a gold-digging mail-order bride suddenly carried new weight. If anyone found out about the mine, if Lorelei found out, Verity would be branded an opportunist regardless of the truth. And a deeper question burrowed into her thoughts like a worm into wood. Was this why Cordell kept his wall so high? Was his guardedness not just about losing Linnea, but about protecting a secret that could make him a target? Was the gold mine the reason Celia had left? were the letters in Verity's valise connected to the map in Cordell's desk. Secrets Verity was learning were like snow on a rooftop. They accumulated slowly, silently, growing heavier with each passing day until the day the roof collapsed. But before the roof could collapse, two more truths came to light that shook the walls. The first arrived through Thatcher. One afternoon, Verity was washing dishes when he stepped into the kitchen, leaned against the counter, and turned a coffee cup in his hands with the slow deliberateness of a man rehearsing words he was afraid to speak. His usual easy smile was gone. "Verity, I need to tell you something." She dried her hands on her apron and waited. Thatcher looked more serious than she had ever seen him, his whiskey-colored eyes dark with a weight she did not understand. "Cordell placed the advertisement, but I was the one who answered your letter." The floor seemed to tilt beneath Verity's feet. "What do you mean?" "Your letter arrived while Cordell was away driving cattle to the railhead. Dutch brought it to me because I handle the mail. I read it." He paused, looking down at the cup. "And I wrote back. The letter you received, the one with the passage money, those were my words, my handwriting." Verity felt the blood drain from her face. "You wrote your letter shows character." "Yes." "And passage enclosed." "Yes." "So Cordell didn't choose me." "Cordell didn't know until after you arrived. I told him the morning after your first night here." He was angry. Thatcher's jaw tightened at the memory. "But then he read your original letter, the one you sent, and he agreed that bringing you here was the right thing to do." Verity stood very still, her hands wet, her heart hammering. She did not know what to feel. Betrayed because the letter she had treasured during 6 days of stagecoach misery had been written under false pretenses, or moved because someone had read her desperate, honest words and seen in them a person worth knowing. "You should have told me sooner," she said. "I know. And you should understand that I am here for Cordell. That was the arrangement." Thatcher nodded slowly. His eyes held hers, and in their amber warmth, Verity saw something she wished she had not seen, something tender and true and impossible. "I know that too." A beat of silence. "But arrangements are not the same as feelings." He left the kitchen before she could respond. Verity stood at the sink with water dripping from her fingers and realized that the 1-month trial she had proposed had become infinitely more complicated than she had ever imagined. The second truth was simpler, but it cut just as deep. One evening after Willa had fallen asleep and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, Verity stepped onto the front porch to watch the stars. The Montana sky was a thing she would never get used to, so vast and so crowded with light that it made the sky over Philadelphia seem like a ceiling painted by a miser. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and breathed the cold air and tried to empty her mind of everything except the beauty above her. She heard the door open. Cordell stepped out and stood beside her, closer than usual, his shoulder nearly touching hers. He did not speak, and Verity did not force him. They stood together in the dark for 10 minutes, listening to the owl calling from the pine ridge and the distant murmur of the creek running beneath its shell of ice. Then Cordell spoke, his voice barely louder than the wind. "Linnea used to stand here. Same spot. Same time of night." Verity held her breath. This was the first time he had spoken his dead wife's name to her voluntarily, not in explanation or necessity, but in something closer to offering. She said the stars up here look closer than anywhere else on earth, like God was leaning down to listen. She was right, Verity said softly. Silence stretched between them. Not empty, but full, the way a river is full, even when its surface is still. "I'm not a good man, Verity." Cordell spoke without looking at her, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the porch rail. "I'm hard. I work too much. I don't know how to say what I feel. Linnea used to tell me I was a locked door. She spent years looking for the key." He paused. "Without her, I'm just rock." "Rock is strong," Verity said. "Rock lasts." He turned to look at her. Starlight fell into his amber eyes and made them glow warm and liquid, nothing like the cold stone he claimed to be. "You're too kind to a man who doesn't deserve it. You deserve more than you think, Cordell." It was the first time she had used his given name. It slipped from her lips as naturally as breathing, as though she had been saying it her whole life, and only now found the courage to speak it aloud. Cordell held her gaze. For a long moment, something moved between them that had no name. Something made of starlight and grief and the tentative, terrified reaching of two people who had both forgotten how to be held. Then he touched her hand, briefly, gently, the tips of his fingers brushing across the back of her wrist. And then he stepped back inside and the door closed softly behind him, and Verity stood alone on the porch with her heart hammering and her hand tingling, where his fingers had been wondering whether she had imagined the moment or whether it was the most real thing that had ever happened to her. The evenings by the fire with Thatcher continued, and Verity found herself caught in a current she did not know how to escape. After Willa went to bed, Thatcher would settle into the leather chair by the hearth and read aloud. Shakespeare mostly. His voice was warm and rhythmic, rising and falling, with the language the way a boat rises and falls with the tide. And Verity sat in Linnea's old rocking chair and listened and felt the words wash over her like water over sun-warmed stones. One night he read from The Tempest, and when he reached the passage where Miranda sees other people for the first time and cries out in wonder at their existence, Thatcher stopped. "Do you know what those words mean?" he asked. "She's seeing the world for the first time," Verity said. "She grew up alone. Everything is new." Thatcher looked at her across the firelight. "You're her Verity. You grew up isolated, controlled, and now you're seeing a whole new world with all its flaws and wonders." "And who are you in the story?" Verity asked, keeping her voice light. Thatcher laughed, a soft, rueful sound that held more sadness than humor. "I suppose I'm the shipwrecked fool who falls in love with the first brave woman he meets." The words settled between them like embers fallen from a fire. Verity felt warmth rise to her face that had nothing to do with the hearth. Thatcher seemed to realize what he had said. He looked away. "I should not have said that." "It was a beautiful thing to say," Verity replied quietly, "even if it cannot be more than words." A long silence. Then Thatcher closed the book, stood, and walked to the door. He stopped with his back to her. "For what it's worth, Verity, the woman that Cordell is falling in love with, I chose her. I read her letter, and I knew." He paused. "Someday I'll find my own brave new world, but I will always be grateful that you were the first." He left. Verity sat by the dying fire, her heart aching with the tenderness of a love offered and gently set aside. Not rejected, not mourned, simply recognized as the wrong shape for the space it wanted to fill. The fourth week arrived, and with it the deadline. Verity's 1-month trial was ending on Saturday. She knew she had to make a decision, and she knew with a certainty that frightened her what that decision would be. She did not want to leave. She wanted to stay. Not because she had nowhere else to go, but because this broken house on a mountain in Montana had begun to feel for the first time in her adult life like a place where she belonged. On Friday evening, Willa was asleep and Verity sat alone in the kitchen, staring into the fire, a cup of tea cooling in her hands. Cordell walked in. "Tomorrow," he said. "I know." He sat across from her. Firelight carved his face into planes of light and shadow, hard and angular, but Verity had learned to read what lay behind the granite. She saw wariness, she saw fear, and she saw buried deep as groundwater hope. "What have you decided?" His voice was flat, controlled, but his hands clenched on his thighs beneath the table betrayed the calm he was performing. Verity looked at him steadily. "What would you have me decide?" "I want you to stay. Willa wants you to stay, but I won't beg." "I don't need you to beg, Cordell. I need you to tell me what I am to you. Am I a housekeeper? You're too decent to call a housekeeper. A mother for your daughter and nothing more. Or am I something else?" The fire crackled. The house creaked in the wind. And Cordell Bridger, the man made of granite, the man who had not spoken a complete sentence about his feelings in 2 years, opened his mouth and let the truth fall out like a stone he had been carrying in his chest. "You're everything. You're everything this house was missing, and I'm terrified of what that means." Silence. Absolute ringing silence, broken only by the fire and the wind and the beating of two hearts that had both been alone for too long. Then I'll stay, Verity said. Not because I have nowhere else to go, because I choose this. I choose Willa. I choose this house, and I'm choosing to give you time to figure out what you want. Cordell looked at her. Then slowly, the way a man reaches for something he is afraid will shatter at his touch, he extended his hand across the table and placed it over hers. His hand was large, rough, warm. Hers was small, callous, trembling slightly. They did not speak. They did not need to. But morning brought a different kind of revelation. Verity came downstairs to start breakfast and found Dutch waiting in the kitchen with a face as grim as a funeral. Without speaking, he placed a newspaper on the table. The Copper Creek Gazette, the weekly paper that everyone in town read and pretended they did not. Page 3, a column titled Town Talk. Verity read it once. Then she read it again. Her hands began to shake. The column suggested in language carefully constructed to avoid outright libel, while leaving nothing to the imagination that the Bridger brothers' mail-order arrangement was not as innocent as it seems. It described a young woman from Philadelphia who had inserted herself into a household of 3 unmarried men under questionable pretenses. It invited concerned citizens to speak with Reverend Finch about the moral implications. Who wrote this? Verity asked, though she already knew the answer. Dutch met her eyes. The Gazette's editor is Edmund Bancroft's cousin, and Edmund Bancroft does what his wife tells him. Lorelei. The damage spread faster than winter wind. Within a week, Verity heard through Dutch and Thatcher what the town was calling here. Names that made her stomach clench and her eyes burn with fury she could not afford to show. Someone painted a red X on a supply crate addressed to the Bridger Ranch. The general store refused to sell fabric to Verity when she tried to return. The doctor's wife, the only woman who had shown Verity genuine kindness, turned away when she saw Verity on the street. Cordell's reaction was cold fury. He wanted to ride into town and have a conversation with the newspaper editor. The kind of conversation that ends with someone on the ground. Thatcher stopped him. Violence won't fix gossip. It will prove them right. Nolan, surprisingly, was the angriest of all. Let me handle Bancroft, he said, and the fire in his amber eyes made Verity believe he meant something more permanent than conversation. No. Verity stood between the 3 brothers, 5 feet 2 inches of woman. She was surrounded by nearly 20 feet of furious men, her back straight, her voice steady, her eyes blazing. This is my fight, my reputation, and I'll handle it my way. The following Sunday, Verity walked into the Copper Creek Church alone. She had refused to let any of the brothers accompany her. This was not about protection. This was about standing on her own 2 feet in front of people who wanted to see her kneel. She wore her cleanest dress, the cream cotton she had altered with fabric from the general store back when they would still tear to her. Her cameo brooch sat at her collar. Her hair was pinned back neatly. She looked exactly like what she was, a working woman with nothing to hide and nothing to apologize for. Lorelei sat in the front pew beside her husband, wearing an expression of polished sympathy that fit her face like a mask molded from porcelain. The entire town watched as Verity walked to a pew in the middle of the church, sat down, folded her hands in her lap, and did not look away from anyone. Reverend Finch preached about charity and the sin of bearing false witness. Verity was not sure whether the old minister had chosen his topic deliberately, but she silently thanked him either way. After the service, the congregation gathered in the churchyard, and Lorelei made her move. She spoke loudly enough for every person within 30 feet to hear her voice pitched with practiced concern. Verity, dear, I've been so worried about you. The things people are saying... The things you are saying, Mrs. Bancroft. Verity's voice cut through the churchyard chatter like a blade through silk. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. 30 pairs of eyes fixed on 2 women standing 10 feet apart in the autumn sunshine. Lorelei's perfect smile flickered. I'm sure I don't know what you mean. You know exactly what you've done. You wrote that column. You spread those rumors. You did it because Cordell Bridger never looked at you the way you wanted him to, and you cannot stand that he brought someone else into his home. The churchyard went silent. Lorelei's face drained of color, then flooded with red. How dare you? I dare because I have nothing to lose, Mrs. Bancroft. Verity turned to face the crowd. She let them see her clearly, this small woman in her mended dress with her calloused and her steady eyes and her voice that did not shake even when her knees wanted to buckle. I came here with nothing, one dress, one Bible, no name, no family, no money. You know what that means? It means I cannot be shamed by people who never respected me in the first place. She paused. Let the silence work. I am a mail-order bride. Yes, I answered an advertisement because I was homeless and alone and had no other choice. I'm not ashamed of that. I work, I cook, I clean. I care for a child who lost her mother 2 years ago. I have never behaved improperly with any of the Bridger brothers. And if anyone here has evidence to the contrary, I invite you to speak now. No one spoke. The silence was so complete that Verity could hear a dog barking somewhere on the edge of town and the creek running beneath the wooden bridge at the end of the main street. Reverend Finch stepped forward, his white hair bright in the sunlight, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had spent 60 years studying the difference between right and wrong. I believe Miss Ashford has been clear. Anyone with genuine concerns may speak with me privately. But I will remind this congregation that bearing false witness is a sin that the Almighty does not take lightly. Edmund Bancroft took his wife's arm. Lorelei, let's go. His voice was tight with the particular embarrassment of a man who has just realized that his wife has overplayed her hand. Lorelei stood frozen for a single moment, her perfect composure cracking like ice beneath a boot heel. Then she straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and walked away on her husband's arm with the measured grace of a queen leaving a throne room. But Verity had seen the crack, and she knew that what she had just done was not a victory. It was a wound. Wounded animals are more dangerous than healthy ones, and Lorelei Bancroft was a woman whose entire survival depended on the weapon she wielded with her tongue. The churchyard slowly came back to life around Verity. People began to move, to whisper, to drift toward their wagons and horses with the stunned expression of a crowd that has just witnessed something they will talk about for years. A few women caught Verity's eye and nodded small, careful nods that might have been approval or might have been simple acknowledgement that they had watched a woman stand her ground and survive. The doctor's wife, Anne Danforth, paused beside Verity as she passed and said quietly, "That took courage, Miss Ashford." Then she moved on before Lorelei's allies could see her speaking to the enemy. Verity watched them all walk away. Her knees were shaking so badly she was afraid she might fall. But her voice had not cracked. Not once. When she turned toward the street, she saw them. All three Bridger brothers standing at the end of the road near the horses. They had come after all. They had stood back, letting her fight her own battle, ready to intervene if needed, but respecting her enough to let her stand alone. Nolan tipped his hat as she phoned. "Not bad," he said. It was the longest compliment he had ever given her. Thatcher opened the wagon door, his eyes shining. "You were magnificent." Cordell said nothing. But when the wagon began to move, he sat beside Verity closer than he had ever sat before, and his shoulder pressed against hers, solid and warm for the entire ride home. Verity understood. That was Cordell's way of saying without words that he was proud. The gossip quieted after that, though it did not disappear entirely. Lorelei retreated, licking her wounds, but Verity knew that a woman like Lorelei Bancroft did not surrender. She regrouped. Verity had won a battle, not the war. One night, unable to sleep, Verity went down to the kitchen for water and found Nolan sitting alone beside the dying fire. A bottle of whiskey stood on the floor beside his chair, half empty. He stared into the embers with the unfocused gaze of a man who was not looking at the fire but at something much further away. "Can't sleep either?" Nolan asked without turning around. Verity sat in the chair across from him. For the first time since she arrived, they were alone together, without tension, without hostility, without an audience. Just two people awake in the small hours when the rest of the world was dreaming. "Nolan," Verity said gently, "why did your mother leave?" His entire body went rigid. The bottle paused halfway to his lips. The fire popped and sent a shower of sparks spiraling into the blackened chimney. A minute passed. 2. Verity thought he would not answer. She was already preparing to apologize for asking when his voice came flat and empty, stripped of everything that made Nolan Bridger the wild brother, the angry one, the one who kept the world at arm's length with his fists. I was 5. Woke up one morning. She was gone. Pa said she went to visit family back east. Then he said she wasn't coming back. Then he stopped saying anything about her at all. Do you remember her? I remember her hands, soft. She used to hold my face when she sang to me. He took a long drink from the bottle. And I remember the morning she left. Her coat was gone from the hook by the door, her boots, her sewing box, everything she could carry. She packed Verity. It wasn't sudden. She planned to leave us. Maybe there's more to the story than you know. Don't. His voice was a blade sharp enough to draw blood. Don't tell me she had reasons. Don't tell me she was coming back. Everyone says that. It doesn't change the empty hook where her coat used to hang. Verity did not speak again. She understood that Nolan did not need words. He did not need comfort or explanation or gentle reassurance. He needed someone to sit in the dark with him and not try to fix what was broken, because some broken things cannot be fixed. They can only be witnessed. They sat until the fire burned down to gray ash and the room grew cold. Then Nolan stood. He looked at Verity for a long time, really looked. And she saw something behind his eyes that she had never seen before. Not anger, not defiance, respect. You didn't run, he said. After the wolves, after the town, after Nolan Bridger at his worst. He paused. That means something. He went upstairs. Verity sat alone in the cold kitchen, holding a cup of water she had forgotten to drink, and thought 3 brothers, 3 wounds, all made by the same blade. The mother who left. And somewhere in this house, hidden in a locked valise, her letters waited. That night, after Nolan's words still echoed in the dark hallways, Verity could not wait any longer. She retrieved the bundle of letters, with the letters from her valise, and read them by the light of a single candle. There were 5 letters written in an elegant hand that trembled with emotion rather than age. The dates spanned from 1858 to 1863. 4 Willa was born, when Nolan was still a small child clinging to his mother's skirts. The first letter, dated 1858, was addressed to a friend in St. Louis. Celia Bridger wrote that her husband Amos had changed since discovering gold on their land. He had become obsessed with protecting the secret, suspicious of everyone, including his own wife. He had forbidden Celia from leaving the ranch, from receiving mail, from speaking to anyone outside the family. The second letter described Amos, accusing Celia of plotting to sell the mining secret to outsiders. He threatened to take the children if she disobeyed. He is not the man I married, Celia wrote. The gold has eaten him alive. The third letter was harder to read. Celia described a man consumed by paranoia, shouting breaking things, controlling every aspect of her life. He never struck her, but the walls he built around her were as effective as any chain. I stay for my boys, but I am disappearing piece by piece. The fourth letter was the shortest. Celia had made her decision. She would leave. She would go to St. Louis, find a lawyer, and return to claim her children. I am not abandoning them. I am saving myself so that I can save them. The fifth letter was the last, written from St. Louis. Celia had hired an attorney, but before she could return to Montana, she received a message from Amos through his own lawyer. If she came back, he would tell the boys she had left because she did not love them. He would make sure she never saw her children again. And in Montana territory, where a woman had no more legal standing than livestock, his threat was not empty. It was a certainty. The final words of the final letter burned into Verity's eyes like a brand. My dearest boys, if you are reading this, then I have failed to come back. And I need you to know the truth about why I left. I left because your father gave me no other choice. But I never stopped loving you. Not for one day, not for 1 hour. Every morning I wake up and pray that someday you will know the truth. The letters had never been sent. All 5 sat in Linnea's writing desk, unsent, unread, sealed in their envelopes with the addresses of people who had never received them. Linnea had found them after Amos died 3 years ago, but she herself had died of pneumonia before she could tell anyone what she had discovered. And so she had placed them where they would wait, hidden in a drawer that only a woman would think to open, patient, as seeds buried in winter soil waiting for the right hands to bring them into the light. Verity sat on her bed in the cold room with the letters in her lap and tears running down her cheeks. She understood now, all of it. The empty hook where Celia's coat had hung. Nolan's fury at a mother who had packed her bags and walked away. Cordell's granite walls built not just against grief, but against the terror of being abandoned again. Thatcher's gentle sadness, the guilt of a man who had gone east to Boston while his family fractured behind him. All of it grew from the same poison root, a lie that Amos Bridger had planted in his sons' hearts and watered with 20 years of silence. Their mother had not abandoned them. She had been driven out, threatened, caged by a man who loved gold more than he loved the woman who had followed him across 1,000 miles of wilderness. And when she had finally found the courage to leave, he had used their own children as weapons to make sure she could never come back. The three brothers had spent their entire adult lives believing that their mother did not love them enough to stay. And that belief had shaped everything. Cordell's inability to trust, Nolan's conviction that all women leave, Thatcher's desperate need to earn love through gentleness and words because he had been taught that love was something that could be revoked without warning. Verity had to tell them, but the truth was a blade that cut both ways. It would free them from one wound, the wound of believing they were unlovable, but it would inflict another, the knowledge that the father they had honored, the man whose ranch they had sacrificed everything to maintain, had been their mother's jailer. Verity's mind raced. She had to tell them. But the truth would destroy the image of Amos Bridger, the father Cordell had worshipped, the man who built the ranch that all three brothers had sacrificed their lives to maintain. The truth would tear the Bridger family apart at its foundation. But hiding the truth the way Linnea had hidden it, dying before she could speak, was that any different from repeating the cycle of secrets that had destroyed this family in the first place? Verity looked at the letters, looked at the door, listened to the house breathing around her, the creak of old wood, the whisper of wind through the pines, the silence of 5 people sleeping with wounds that Verity now held the medicine to heal. She made her decision. The next morning, Verity walked downstairs with the letters in her hand. The 3 brothers sat at the kitchen table. Cordell was silent over his coffee. Thatcher was reading. Nolan was staring into his cup of black coffee as though it contained the answers to questions he had stopped asking years ago. "I found something," Verity said. Her voice was steady, but her hands were trembling. "In Linnea's room, something she was keeping for you." 3 pairs of amber eyes looked up at her. The same eyes, the same shade, the same sharp intelligence inherited from the same father. Looking at them in that moment, sitting side by side, Verity understood for the first time how alike they truly were, and how different, and how the same wound had shaped each of them into entirely different men. Verity placed the bundle of letters on the kitchen table. The faded ribbon, the trembling handwriting, the name on the first envelope written in ink that had turned brown with the weight of 20 years of silence. "These are from your mother," Verity said. "All of them, and you need to read them." Silence fell over the kitchen like the first snow of winter. Soft, slow, cold on. And beneath the silence, something vast and old and terribly fragile began to stir, rising from the place where 3 brothers had buried it decades ago, the place where grief becomes anger, and anger becomes armor, and armor becomes the only face you know how to show the world. 3 hands reached for the letters at the same time. And everything that the Bridger family had built on the lie of a mother who chose to leave began at last to crack. 3 brothers sat at the kitchen table. 3 pairs of amber eyes. 3 pairs of hands reaching for a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon. And Verity stood by the fireplace with her own hands clasped before her, watching the truth do what truth always does, burn. Cordell read the slowest. He held each letter with both hands carefully, the way a man holds something that might shatter if his grip tightens. His face did not change. It remained granite, locked, impenetrable. But Verity, who had spent weeks learning to read the language hidden beneath that stone, watched his jaw clench tighter, with each page tighter and tighter, as though he were biting down on something that was trying to scream its way out of his chest. When he finished the last letter, he placed it on the table with the precision of a man setting down a loaded weapon. He aligned the edges, smoothed the fold, then he stood, walked through the back door, and disappeared into the snow without a coat. Thatcher read the fastest. His eyes moved down the pages with the speed of a man accustomed to consuming words the way others consume water. But his hands betrayed him. They shook. By the second letter, the pages trembled so badly that the ink seemed to dance. When he reached the third letter, the one where Celia described their father's drunken rages, his shouting, his breaking of things, Thatcher set the pages down, closed his eyes, and let the tears come. He did not wipe them. He did not hide them. He did not apologize. He wept silently, openly, with the profound relief of a man whose body was finally being permitted to grieve something his mind had denied for 20 years. "She didn't leave us," Thatcher whispered. His voice cracked on the last word like ice breaking on a spring river. "She didn't leave." Nolan was the last to finish, and his reaction was the most terrifying. He read the final page, he stood, and he drove his fist straight into the kitchen wall. Wood splintered, knuckles split, blood appeared on the pine planks. He hit the wall again and again. Each blow carried the accumulated force of 20 years of misdirected fury, 20 years of believing he was unlovable, 20 years of blaming a woman who had loved him so much that she had destroyed herself trying to find a way back to him. He lied. Nolan's voice was no longer human. It was the sound of a wounded animal, raw and primitive and terrible. Pa lied. Our whole lives he lied. He told us she didn't want us. He told us she chose to leave. I was 5 years old. Thatcher reached for him. "Nolan, stop." "Don't tell me to stop." Nolan ripped his arm away, his eyes wild, his face wet with tears he refused to acknowledge. "I spent 20 years hating her, 20 years believing I wasn't enough for my own mother to stay. And he made me believe that. He built that lie and he put it inside me and he let it grow until it poisoned everything I touched." Nolan turned to Verity. For one terrible second, she was afraid. Afraid that his rage would find the nearest target, that she would become the lightning rod for a storm that had been building since before she was born. But Nolan looked at her, breathing hard, his chest heaving, his bleeding hand hanging at his side, and said 2 words. "Thank you." The weight of those 2 words was greater than anything Verity had ever carried. Greater than the valise she had hauled across 6 states, greater than in the silence of Aunt Martha's attic, greater than the wolves and the farm and the cold and every hard thing that had brought her to this kitchen on this morning. Those 2 words carried 20 years of resentment, cracking and falling away like ice from a rooftop in March. Nolan walked through the front door, mounted his horse, and rode into the forest at a gallop. He did not return until late that night, silent, his hand wrapped in a crude bandage he had fashioned himself, his eyes red but calmer. He went straight upstairs without eating. Cordell came back 3 hours after he had left. He had walked through the snow without his coat, and his cheeks were blue with cold. Verity pressed a cup of hot coffee into his hands. He held it but did not drink. "My father built this ranch." His voice was flat, controlled, the voice of a man narrating the destruction of his own foundations. "With his hands, his sweat, his blood, he taught me everything I know, how to ride, how to shoot, how to work this land until it yielded. I worshipped him, Verity. I worshipped every callus on his hands." Verity said nothing. She waited. And he was a monster. Cordell looked down at his own hands, as though seeing them for the first time and wondering whose they were. Not the kind that uses his fists, the kind that uses control, the kind that takes everything someone loves and turns it into a chain. Cordell. He kept her caged on this mountain until she had to tear herself apart to escape. And then he told us she left because she didn't love us enough to stay. Cordell's voice broke. It was the first time Verity had ever heard that voice crack, and the sound of it was like hearing a mountain split. He lied to 3 little boys about their mother. He let us grow up believing we were not worth staying for. The coffee cup slipped from his shaking hands. Verity caught it before it hit the floor. set it aside, and when she straightened up, Cordell did something she never expected. He reached for her. He took her wrist gently, but with the desperate grip of a man clinging to the only solid thing in a world that was dissolving beneath his feet. "Don't go," he said. "Please, don't go." "I'm not going anywhere. Everyone goes. Ma went. Linnea went. Everyone I have ever loved has walked away from me. I'm here." Verity took his hand in both of hers. "Right here." Cordell looked at her, and in his amber eyes, Verity watched the final collapse. Every wall, every defense, every year of granite silence in controlled strength. It all came down at once, not crumbling, but falling like a dam, releasing a lake that had been pressing against it for decades. She saw beneath the man the 13-year-old boy who had woken one morning to find his mother's coat gone from the hook by the door. He did not cry, but he lowered his head, pressed his forehead against her shoulder, and breathed. Great shuddering breaths that moved through his entire body like tremors through the earth. Verity held still, her hand resting on his head, her fingers moving gently through his dark hair, and she thought, this is what it means to hold someone. Not with strength, with presence. 2 weeks passed. The Bridger family began the slow, painful process of healing. For the first time in 2 decades, the brothers spoke about their mother, not as the woman who left, but as the woman who was taken. Thatcher wrote a letter to St. Louis addressed to the last known location of Celia Bridger, hoping that some thread of connection might still exist. Nolan drank less. Cordell began telling Will about her grandmother, choosing his words with the careful tenderness of a man learning a language he had forgotten. "She loved you before you were born, sweetheart. She just couldn't be here." Verity had become the center of the household, not because she demanded attention, but because she had been the one to bring the truth. She was the vessel through which the poison had been drained, and in its absence, something fragile and new had begun to grow. But Lorelei Bancroft was not finished. She arrived at the ranch on a Wednesday afternoon in a hired carriage wearing her finest dress and the expression of a woman holding a winning hand. Verity answered the door. "I come in peace," Lorelei said. Her smile was different than before. Not cruel, but calculating, the smile of a card player who has drawn the ace she has been waiting for. "Cordell is in the field," Verity said. "Then perhaps you'll deliver a message." Lorelei reached into her silk handbag and produced a folded document. "I found this at the Montana Territory Land Office. A mining claim filed in the name of Amos Bridger, now held by his sons. Fascinating reading. I had no idea the Bridger family was sitting on quite such a fortune." Verity looked at the document. Her stomach dropped. "This information is public record," Lorelei continued, her voice honeyed with false concern. "Available to anyone who looks. The Gazette, for instance, or the mining companies back east, or the territory tax assessor who might have questions about the Bridgers' reported assets. What do you want, Mrs. Bancroft?" "What I have always wanted: stability, security, influence." Lorelei leaned forward. "Here is my proposal. You leave, quietly. I will provide passage to Philadelphia and enough money to start fresh. In return, I do not publish the mining claim." Verity looked at Lorelei for a long time, and for the first time she saw past the silk and the scheming and the carefully constructed armor of beauty and manipulation, and she saw the woman beneath. A girl from Virginia sold into marriage at 17 to a man 30 years her senior, shipped west like cargo, valued only for her face and her compliance, building the only kind of power available to her in a world that gave women nothing the power of whispers of secrets of strategic cruelty. Verity recognized that woman, because Verity had almost become her. One different turn, one different advertisement, one different kind of desperation. And Verity might have learned to survive with her tongue instead of her hands. "No," Verity said. Lorelei's composure cracked like thin ice. "No, you don't understand what you're protecting. Those men lied to you. They kept the gold a secret. They let you scrub floors in a house they could afford to staff 10 times over. There is a difference," Verity said slowly, "between a man who keeps secrets out of shame and a man who keeps secrets for control. The Bridgers are the first. You, Mrs. Bancroft, are the second. Lorelei stared at her. For a moment, the mask fell completely, and Verity saw something she had not expected. Not anger, not calculation, exhaustion. The deep bone-level weariness of a woman who had been performing the role of villain because it was the only role her world offered, and who was beginning to realize that the audience was leaving the theater. "You don't know what it's like," Lorelei said, and her voice was stripped of all its polish, all its silk. "To be worth nothing except what a man gives you. To spend your entire life borrowing power because the world won't let you earn your own." "I know exactly what that's like," Verity replied. "I lived it for 4 years in my aunt's attic. The difference between us, Mrs. Bancroft, is that I chose to build something instead of tearing someone else's down." Lorelei's chin trembled. For one extraordinary instant, she looked like the 17-year-old girl who had been shipped from Virginia to Montana as part of a business transaction. Then the mask returned, though it fit less perfectly than before, and she turned and walked to her carriage. "You will regret this," she said over her shoulder, but the conviction had drained from her voice like water from a cracked cup. "Maybe," Verity said, "but at least I will know the choice was mine." Lorelei left. Verity sat on the porch steps and watched the carriage grow small on the mountain road until it disappeared around the final bend. Her hands were steady, her heart was still hammering, but somewhere deep in her chest, in the place where fear had lived for most of her life, she felt something new taking root. Not courage exactly, something quieter, the settled certainty of a woman who has finally stopped running and decided to stand. That evening, Verity sat the three brothers down at the kitchen table, the same table where their father's lies had been exposed, and she laid out the final secret. "I know about the gold." The room went still. Cordell turned to stone. Thatcher closed his eyes. Nolan strangely did not look surprised. "I found the mining map weeks ago," Verity continued. "I said nothing because it was not my business. But now Lorelei Bancroft knows, and she is threatening to expose it unless I leave." "She what?" Nolan rose from his chair. "Sit down, Nolan. All of you. We are going to talk about this like a family." And for the first time since she had arrived, Verity took full command of the conversation. She told them everything. The map in the desk, Lorelei's visit, the ultimatum. And then she asked the question that cut deepest. "Why didn't you tell me?" Cordell answered. His words came slowly, each one tested before it left his mouth. "Our father's gold destroyed our family. It made him paranoid, controlling. It drove our mother away. When he died, the three of us swore an oath. The gold would never control us. We would use it sparingly, live simply, and never let anyone outside the family know. Even someone you invited into the family." Cordell flinched as though she had slapped him. "I was wrong. I should have told you. I was afraid." "Of what?" "That you would look at me and see my father." The words settled in the air like ash after a fire. Verity understood. Cordell's deepest terror was not that she would leave. It was that he would become Amos Bridger, that the gold would corrupt him the same way, that keeping secrets from the woman he loved was the first step down the exact road that had destroyed his parents' marriage. "You are not your father, Cordell," Verity said firmly. "But you will become him if you keep making decisions for other people without telling them why." Thatcher nodded. "She's right." Nolan crossed his arms. "What do we do about Bancroft?" "We tell the truth," Verity said. "File the mining claim properly. Pay the taxes. Let the whole territory know. Lorelei's power comes from the secret. Remove the secret, and she has nothing." Cordell nodded first, then Thatcher, then half a beat slower Nolan. "No more secrets," Cordell said. "From any of us. Deal." Verity extended her hand. Cordell took it, but this time he did not let go after 2 seconds. He held it firm and warm, his thumb tracing a slow circle against her wrist, and Verity felt something shift beneath her. Not the ground breaking, the opposite. A foundation settling, finding bedrock at last. Lorelei made good on her threat. The Gazette published the mining claim story. But when the news broke, it did not produce the scandal Lorelei had imagined. Thatcher had spent the intervening week filing proper paperwork, paying back taxes, and bringing every aspect of the Bridger mining operation into full legal compliance. The town's reaction was not outrage, but grudging respect. The Bridgers had gold and chose to live simply, in a territory full of men who spent every cent on whiskey, and display that kind of restraint earned more admiration than contempt. Edmund Bancroft, recognizing that his wife had overreached, ordered the Gazette to print a correction and an apology. Lorelei retreated into the silence of her brick house on the main street. Her influence diminished, her schemes exhausted. She was not a villain defeated. She was a woman who had finally reached the edge of manipulation and found nothing beyond it. Verity, against all her own expectations, felt pity. 2 weeks after the scandal died, on a morning so cold that breath turned to crystal the instant it left the body, Verity was baking bread, the ritual that had become her signature, the act that had first made this house smell like home, when Willa burst into the kitchen. "Papa says come outside quick." Verity wiped her hands on her apron, stepped onto the porch, and stopped. The three Bridger brothers stood in the yard, all three. In the pale morning light, their breath rising like smoke, their shoulders squared, their faces serious. Cordell stood in the center with Thatcher on his right and Nolan on his left. All three wore their best clothes, not suits. There were no suits on this mountain, but clean pressed shirts and polished boots and hats that had been brushed free of dust. Behind them, Dutch stood with his hat pulled low over his face, but Verity could see his shoulders shaking. He was laughing or crying, possibly both. Cordell stepped forward. In his hand, trembling slightly, he held a ring. Not a diamond, a simple band of silver hand-carved etched with the delicate shape of a pine branch. Verity Ashford. His voice was rough gravel, but steadier than she had ever heard it, as though he had been rehearsing these words in his head for days and had finally decided to trust his mouth with them. "I am not a man of words. My brother got that gift." He nodded toward Thatcher, who smiled. "And I am not a man of grand gestures. Nolan got that." Nolan snorted, but his eyes were warm. "What I am is a man who stands where he promises to stand, and I am promising to stand beside you. Every morning, every storm, every day you will have me." Verity's eyes burned. "Cordell, I know I am not what you imagined when you answered that advertisement. I am not gentle or smooth or easy. I come with a mountain, a ranch, two brothers who eat too much, a daughter who will never let you have a moment's peace, and a past that could fill a book of sorrows." He paused. His amber eyes shone in the cold sunlight. "But I also come with this. I love you. I did not plan to. I tried not to, but I do." Verity looked at Thatcher. He stepped forward, his voice soft as snowfall. "He speaks for all of us, Verity. This family's yours, has been since the night you sang through Willa's door." She looked at Nolan. He shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable, under the spotlight of an emotional moment, but he met her eyes without flinching. "I said women always leave. I was wrong," he swallowed. "Stay." Willa tugged at the hem of Verity's apron. "Say yes, Miss Verity. Say yes, please." Verity looked at the ring in Cordell's hand. Small, simple, nothing like the diamond on Lorelei Bancroft's finger. But the silver was warm from his palm, and the pine branch had been carved by hands that had built fences and broken horses and carried a daughter through snowstorms, and once reached for Verity's wrist in the kitchen as though she were the last solid thing in a dissolving world. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "One condition," she said. Cordell's face tightened. "Anything. You call me Verity, not Miss Ashford, not my wife, just Verity." His smile broke through, slow, wide, utterly transformative, turning his granite face into something she had never seen before. Joy, pure, unguarded, terrified joy. "Verity," he said, as though tasting the word for the first time. "Verity." She took the ring and put it on her own finger because her hands were shaking too badly for him to do it. It fit as though it had been waiting for her. Willa shrieked with delight and launched herself at both of them. Dutch blew his nose into his handkerchief and muttered something about dust. Thatcher laughed a sound like clear water running over stones. And Nolan walked forward, looked down at Verity from his full towering height, and did something no one in the yard expected. He bent down and pressed his lips to her forehead. Brief, rough, a brother's blessing. Welcome to the family, he said. God help you. Verity laughed. A real laugh, full and free, a sound she had not made in so many years that she barely recognized it as her own. She wrapped her arm around Nolan's waist before he could retreat, and he stiffened for a moment before slowly, awkwardly placing his arm across her shoulder. For one perfect moment, they all stood there in the cold morning light. Cordell holding Verity's hand, Willa clinging to their legs, Nolan's arm across Verity's shoulder, Thatcher standing close, tears bright in his whiskey-colored eyes, Dutch weeping openly behind them. 5 broken people and 1 small girl standing in front of a house that had once been a prison and was becoming a home. The wedding was held 3 weeks later in the White Clapper Church of Copper Creek. It was small. Ranch hands filled one side, men who had watched the Bridger brothers grow, up men who had tipped their hats to Linnea and carried her coffin, and wondered in the quiet way of working men whether this family would survive the loss. Dutch sat in the front pew wearing a suit that looked as though it had last been worn during the Grant administration, his blue eyes suspiciously bright from the moment Verity appeared at the church door. Anne Danforth, the doctor's wife, sat near the back, the only woman from the town who had shown Verity genuine kindness through every storm, and her presence meant more to Verity than every silk dress in Lorelei Bancroft's wardrobe. Reverend Finch stood at the altar with a Bible and a smile that said he had been waiting for this day longer than anyone knew. Verity walked down the aisle on Thatcher's arm because she had no father. He walked slowly, matching her pace, his hand steady beneath hers. And when they reached the altar, he placed her hand into Cordell's with a gesture so careful and deliberate that every person in the church understood what it cost him. He was giving her away, not because she belonged to him, but because loving someone sometimes means carrying them to the place where they belong, even when that place is someone else's arms. Thatcher stepped back, and his eyes were bright, and he smiled the way only a truly good man smiles when he chooses grace over grief. Verity wore a dress sewn from cream fabric that Thatcher had bought for her, trimmed with lace that Dutch had ordered from Denver. Her mother's cameo brooch sat at her throat, the only object she had carried across 6 states in 2 lifetimes, the last physical connection to the girl she had been before Montana remade her. Cordell stood at the front of the church. His back was straight, his jaw was tight. But when Verity appeared in the doorway, his amber eyes caught the light and blazed, and Verity saw his granite face do something it had almost forgotten how to do. It softened, not into weakness, into wonder. Nolan stood beside his brother as best man, his hands shoved in his pockets, his face red because he hated crowds but would not have missed this moment for all the gold in Montana. When Verity passed him, he nodded, deep, slow, full of respect. Willa was the flower girl. She wore a white dress that Verity had sewn by hand, her dark hair braided on both sides, and she carried a basket of dried lavender that she scattered along the aisle with the grave seriousness of a child performing the most important task of her life. Reverend Finch spoke briefly about second chances and the courage required to begin again. Verity listened, but mostly she looked at Cordell, at the man who had placed an advertisement in a newspaper because his daughter needed a mother, at the man who had left warm water outside her door every morning without ever expecting thanks, at the man whose greatest fear was becoming his father and whose greatest courage was allowing himself to love again. "I do," Cordell said. His voice cracked on the second word. "I do," Verity said, and every cell in her body believed it. He kissed her gently, reverently, his hands cupping her face as though she were something precious and impossibly fragile. Verity closed her eyes and thought, this is what home feels like. Not a building, not a location, a person, a promise. "Now she's my mama," Willa shouted, and the church erupted in laughter and tears and the sound of Dutch blowing his nose so loudly that Reverend Finch lost his place in the benediction. On the morning of the wedding before the ceremony, Thatcher had come to Verity's room with a letter in his hand. His face held an expression she had never seen before, something between disbelief and radiance, as though Someone had lit a candle inside his chest. "This came yesterday," he said, "from St. Louis." Verity opened the letter. The handwriting was unfamiliar, trembling but neat, the penmanship of someone who had once written beautifully, but whose hands had grown unsteady with age or emotion. She read the words and felt the floor disappear beneath her feet. "Dear Thatcher, I am alive. I am well. And I would very much like to come home. Celia Bridger." Verity looked at Thatcher. Thatcher looked at Verity, and they both wept. "She's alive," Thatcher whispered. "She's coming home," Verity replied. They agreed to wait until after the wedding to tell the others. The news was too enormous, too beautiful, and too frightening to be absorbed alongside marriage vows. Some truths require their own ceremony. A week after the wedding, Verity told Cordell and Nolan. She chose a winter evening after Willow was asleep, when the three of them sat before the fire, the way they had sat so many times before, the way this family would sit for years to come, in the warm light with the mountain wind outside and the smell of bread still lingering in the kitchen. Cordell was silent for a very long time. Then he said simply, "Invite her." Nolan's reaction was the one Verity had feared most. He stood by the window, his back to the room, looking out at the snow that covered the world. When he spoke, his voice was smaller than Verity had ever heard it. Not the voice of the wild brother, the angry one, the man who fought and drank and kept the world at bay with his fists. The voice of a 5-year-old boy. "She's my mother," Nolan said. "She's my mother, and she's alive." "Yes," Verity said. He turned. His amber eyes were full, the tears he had refused to shed for 20 years, finally gathering, finally rising, finally on the verge of falling. "Will you write to her? I don't—" His voice broke. He pressed his fist against his mouth and breathed hard through his nose, fighting for control the way he fought wild horses with raw, stubborn will. "I don't know what to I've spent 20 years hating her. I don't know how to go from hating to anything else. I don't have the words." "I'll write," Verity said. "I'll tell her you're waiting." Nolan nodded. Then he said very quietly, as though confessing a secret he had carried in silence for 2 decades. "Tell her I remember her hands. Soft. She used to hold my face when she sang. And tell her I named my horse Midnight because she used to call me her midnight star. She said I was born under the darkest sign and the brightest star." Verity's throat closed around a knot of grief so sharp it took her breath away. "Tell her I forgive her," Nolan whispered. "Tell her Pa made it impossible. Tell her I understand now." He paused, his jaw worked. "And tell her I grew tall. She would want to know I grew up tall." Verity almost laughed through her tears. "I'll tell her everything." Nolan walked outside, but this time he did not ride away. He sat on the porch steps in the cold, looking up at the stars, and Verity knew he was looking at the same sky his mother saw from St. Louis. And for the first time, the distance between them did not feel infinite. Verity sat at the kitchen table that night and wrote the most important letter of her life. "Dear Mrs. Bridger, my name is Verity. I married your eldest son, Cordell, 1 week ago. I am writing on behalf of your youngest, Nolan, who asked me to tell you the following. He does not hate you anymore. He remembers your hands. He remembers you holding his face when you sang. He named his horse Midnight because you used to call him your midnight star. He looked for you, Mrs. Bridger, in every woman who passed through Copper Creek. For 20 years, he looked hoping one of them might be you. He forgives you. He understands now what his father did, and he wants you to know that he grew tall, very tall." She paused, wiped her eyes, continued. "Your son Thatcher found your letters. We read them. We know the truth about why you left. There are no more lies in this house, Mrs. Bridger. Only an open door and 3 sons who would very much like their mother to come home." She signed it, "With respect and hope, Verity Bridger." She sealed the letter and placed it in Dutch's hands for the next mail run. Dutch held the envelope against his chest as though it were sacred, his blue eyes shining with the particular brightness of a man who had carried someone else's guilt for 30 years and was finally setting it down. "You are the best thing that ever happened to this family, Verity," he said. Don't let anyone, including yourself, tell you different. Spring came early that year. The snow retreated up the mountain slopes like a white army in slow surrender. The creek ran free, singing over stones it had not seen in months. New grass pushed through the thawing earth, green and tender, and the Hereford cattle dropped their calves in the lower pastures, while hawks circled overhead in a sky so blue it seemed to vibrate. Verity stood on the porch of the Bridger Ranch, the same porch she had climbed 6 months earlier, carrying a single valise, her heart full of nothing but fear. She looked out at the world she had been given, and she saw all of it. Willa running in the yard, her dark hair flying behind her. Rosie the doll bouncing in one hand, chasing the barn cat she had named Biscuit after Verity's morning bread. Cordell riding in the far pasture, his back straight on the saddle, and every few minutes he turned his head toward the house, just for a second, just to see Verity standing there. And then he turned back to his work. He always checked, not to control, because every time he saw her, they're still there, he breathed a little easier. Thatcher sat on the porch beside her, reading a book, occasionally reading a passage aloud. Nolan worked in the barn with a new Mustang, his voice low and patient, the voice he saved for animals and for Willa, and lately for Verity when he thought no one else was listening. Dutch sat at the kitchen table, composing a letter to Celia confirming that the road home was open, that the 3 children she had been forced to leave behind had grown into men. Broken men, yes, but mended now in waiting. Verity placed her hand on her stomach and smiled. Not because she was carrying a child yet, but because she knew she would someday soon, and when she told Cordell he would kneel in the middle of a field of spring grass and hold her, and weep the kind of tears that come not from sorrow, but from the astonishment of a man who had believed the world was finished, giving him beautiful things. She smiled because she remembered. She remembered the girl on the stagecoach 6 months ago, clutching a leather valise, coming to Montana not out of hope, but out of the sheer absence of alternatives. That girl did not know that life was leading her not to a husband, but to a family. Not to a house, but to a home. Not to safety, but to something far braver, the courage to open the door and let love in. "Miss Verity?" Willa came running up the porch steps, cheeks red, breath short, the cat squirming in her arms. "Uncle Nolan says there's a stagecoach coming up the road." "Who's coming?" Verity looked down the mountain road. Far below, winding through the pines, a small coach was climbing the grade. Slow, steady, patient, the way a person moves when they have traveled a very long way and are afraid that the destination might disappear if they move too quickly. "Someone who has been gone a long time, sweetheart," Verity said. "Someone your papa has been waiting for." She stepped down from the porch. She did not close the door behind her. She left it open, wide open to the spring wind and the sunlight and whoever was coming up that road. Because Verity Ashford Bridger had learned the wilderness truth. Sometimes salvation arrives disguised as strangers in a storm. Sometimes love comes when you have stopped searching for it, carried on wolf song and prayer. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is simply open the door. Outside, the spring wind moved through the pines like a whispered hymn. Inside, the fire burned warm and golden, a beacon promising that even in the hardest seasons, even in the deepest winters, kindness can kindle a home. The wolves were distant now. The cold had passed, and in the morning they would wake to a world made new, a world where the door never closed, where love was imperfect but sufficient, where family was not a matter of a blood, but of choice made again and again and again every single day. Willa took Verity's hand. Cordell appeared on the ridge, saw the stagecoach, and turned his horse toward home. Thatcher set down his book and stood. Nolan came out of the barn, shielding his eyes against the sun, watching the coach approach. And Dutch, sitting at the kitchen table with a pen in his hand and a letter he would never need to finish, looked out the window at the 5 people standing in the spring light waiting together and smiled the smile of a man whose longest, most improbable plan had finally, against all odds, come true. The stagecoach rounded the last bend. Its wheels creaked on the softening road. The driver called to his horses, and the coach slowed, and through the small window a face appeared. A woman's face older than the letters had suggested, lined by years and grief, and the particular weathering that comes from carrying a burden no one else can see. But her eyes were amber, clear and bright and unmistakable. The same amber that looked out from the faces of three tall men who stood in the yard of a ranch built by a man who had loved gold more than he had loved her. Celia Bridger had come home, and Verity Ashford Bridger, the girl from Philadelphia, the orphan, the servant, the mail-order bride who had arrived in Montana with nothing but a valise and a prayer, stood on the porch of her home with her family around her and watched a mother walk toward the sons she had never stopped loving. And she understood at last the truth that the mountains had been trying to teach her since the day she arrived. Home is not a place you find. It is a door you choose to open. And the bravest thing any person can do in any season, in any storm, is to open it wide and let the world walk in.